Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Bob Bruner. For those of you who don't know, I am the exotic forest pest educator with the Department of Entomology at Purdue University. I tend to specialize in invasive species, and I will typically focus on where invasive species intersect with urban forestry or landscapes. And I thought it'd be really interesting to cover this topic because a lot of the folks I talk to often have serious concerns about their landscaping, their yards, and their gardens. And I thought this one was particularly interesting because I've been dealing with a few invasives that both exist within forested environments and within landscape and gardens. I did a lot of research on this one because there were some things that I just myself didn't know and I wanted to double check. So this ought to be a little bit interesting. It'll probably be quick, but I promise I will try to be as thorough as I can. So first off, the thing that I wanted to look at was to define compost. And there isn't really a truly solid definition of compost. It's pretty generalized. I borrowed this from Pennsylvania State University's Extension Service. Compost is organic matter decomposed to a form suitable for plant use in obviously a garden or in a potted plant or on a landscape where the purpose of that compost is to has an intent to help the plants develop. Now, this compost is created by recycling food and plant waste. And that recycling of food and plant waste is often that intersection where we could typically run into problems. But this also means that compost is very variable. It depends on what kind of food you have in your home if you're using food waste, and it also depends on what kind of plants you have on your property. Not all plants will work together very well with composting, whereas some plants may work together very well because of the nutrients they have. And I suspect that regionally you will find a lot of differences between compost piles because of regional differences in plants that are grown there, either intentionally as ornamentals or maybe those that are native to a particular area, as well as just food practices that can vary a lot across a landscape. Now, a little more on what compost provides here. Compost is a great home to bacteria and other microorganisms. Those of you who have been working on compost for a while now, you know that as compost develops throughout a year, in the winter months even, it will remain internally warm because it becomes a sort of biofactory as bacteria and other microorganisms break down the recycled food and plant waste. When it completely decomposes, we typically refer to it as humus, where you have this nice decomposed organic matter that contains a lot of nutrients. And when you add it to soil, it does different things. So I live in an area that has very sandy soil. So if I add compost into the soil that's just naturally here, it will improve its water retention. Because if you look at what compost does, it adds structure into soil. So that way you're varying the soil landscape. You're also adding in space, different parts and bits that are going to have an influence. So if you put it in, say, a clay soil, for those of you who live in more northern Indiana, you're going to see an improvement in aeration because that soil structure is there and it's not just a flat, hard lump of clay. Whereas if you're in southern Indiana, you might see improved water retention as sandy soil suddenly gains structure to be able to hold water longer and more porosity to allow water to flow through at a certain rate and not just flow right through sandy soils. Now, there is another important factor when it comes to compost. This one is a little bit more into the ecology, the scientific ecology portion of it. So I'm an ecologist by training, and a lot of what I think about is in terms of this. I know a lot of you may not understand this. I'm going to try to go through it so you do. So if we start at this little bottom box here, I'm going to see if I could turn my pointer on. The bottom box shows this right here shows organic residues. So this is talking about what is going into compost. And we're looking at leaves, grass clippings, plant debris, food scraps, fecal matter, and potentially animal bodies from soil and vertebrates. And trust me, no matter what you build your compost out of, you are definitely getting animal carcasses, usually in the form of soil and vertebrates, into your compost. That is unavoidable. It's going to happen unless you seal the box perfectly, which I doubt many people are really doing. So this is our organic residue. And next, we come up to the first trophic level. These are called trophic levels of organisms that are going to be working within that compost. So in this case, we're looking at our bacteria and our fungi, other organisms that will break down those plant materials, that plant detritus, all those food scraps. You're going to have nematodes, earthworms, millipedes. This is an environment where snails and slugs are actually really, really useful to you because they're helping break those things down. We refer to these as primary consumers, things that might be called herbivores or saprovores or saprophytes that do this. Next, we go up to secondary consumers. These are the organisms that eat primary consumers. These are things like springtails, some types of mites, some types of beetles, also a lot of nematodes and flatworms, and also protozoa and rotifera, which are smaller multicellular organisms that folks may not know a whole lot about. Um, these are the ones that are eating those herbivores. And then lastly, we have our tertiary consumers. They're the ones who are eating our secondary consumers. So these are primarily predatory or omnivorous organisms, probably insects and similar things like centipedes and beetles and ants that are going after things like springtails and flatworms and other things like that. All of these are going to exist within a compost pile. They are always going to be there, and if your pile is working correctly, if it's doing everything you want it to do, you're going to find those, and that's a good thing. Most of the species you find there, at least in terms of insects, are going to be native. They're probably supposed to be there. There may be a few non-native species. Generally, the non-native ones are not ones that we are going to be truly concerned about. And the insect species that are there are going to be omnivorous or carnivorous, which means they're either going to eat everything between plants or other multicellular organisms or other animals, or some are carnivorous where they're just focusing on other animals. Snails and slugs, I already mentioned, because they are beneficial in this system, even though a lot of times outside of it, we would consider them to be pests as they may attack plant leaves and other things. These are typically also going to be native species. We don't have very many non-native species of snails. We do have some notable examples of them. However, most of the ones that we work with right now that we see here in Indiana are going to be native. I haven't yet been sent any information on an invasive one. The earthworms located on our system, these are really interesting because the earthworms that we work with are almost entirely non-native. Native species were eliminated during glaciation, and most of the ones that we have now were brought over during colonization. However, we want them here because most of them do a really good job of aerating our soil and help improve soil quality for growing food and other plants. And I'm going to go into a little more on that later, and unfortunately, the one non-native earthworm we have that is quite problematic. So why don't we talk a little bit about the kinds of insects and other organisms that we're going to see? Some of the ones that I've mentioned that you may have never heard of before. I like going over these because these are ones that we often teach our entomology students as they get started, and they're ones that people may not realize they see quite a bit. The first one that I want to go over are called springtails. You may hear these referred to as columbella as well. Right now, where they are on the phylogenetic tree is something of an argument. When I was an entomology student, these were considered true insects, whereas if you look up some of the classification now, they're in their own group. They're just considered a part of arthropods, as jointed leg organisms. I'm just going to refer to them as an insect because that makes me happy. I'm not going to worry about the classification. But what's really interesting about springtails is they have this really, really interesting organ at the end of their abdomen. It's kind of like a tail that folds under their body like a spring-loaded mechanism, referred to as a furcula. And this is exactly why they get their names, because when they use this mechanism, that causes them to leap a significant distance proportional to their size. They're very tiny, and in order to identify most of them, you need a hand lens. You'll often find these in really moist environments that have really high organic content because they're consuming that material. Well, I'm sorry, they're consuming organisms in that material, and as they do so, they tend to shred and fragment the organic matter there. So they're helping break down compost at the same time. And what'll happen is you'll maybe move something like a rock or something else, and you'll see these tiny little things that make you think of fleas. And they may be very pale colored or grayish colored that are just bouncing up and down right where you see them. Those are springtails. They are absolutely harmless. They cannot bite you. They're actually really interesting because they belong to a group of insects called intonaths, where all of their mouth parts are located entirely in their head, kind of like humans are. We have all our teeth inside of our head. Most insects don't have that. Most insects are ectonaths, where all their mouth parts are outside of their head, and they chew on their food partially on the outside before they swallow it. Calimbola are generally beneficial in this environment. Sometimes they can also be an indicator of problems if you find them other places, but I wouldn't worry if you see them. They are not harmful themselves in any way. You don't need to worry about that. Another type of insect that you might see in compost is something called a rove beetle. Some of you may be familiar with rove beetles because sometimes they can be problems in honeybee hives. Grove beetles are, like the name indicates, a type of beetle. They have a really interesting feature where their forewings are shortened. So most beetles have elytra or these hardened forewings that cover most of their abdomen. Think of something like a Japanese beetle or a lady beetle that you'll see. They have this really hard armor on their back that covers the entirety of the insect. Grove beetles, they're a whole family of Staphylinidae. They don't have that feature. Their wings are only halfway down their body. They're very short and they just look like wing pads sitting right on top of their abdomen. These insects are primarily predators, but they can also be parasitoidal, where they will attack eggs of other insects or maybe larvae of other insects and have their young use as larvae as a host. Or they might be omnivorous scavengers. And when we're talking about compost, we're typically thinking probably of something that is either predaceous or something that is going to be omnivorous and is scavenging through the compost. This could be beneficial because as they do their work, the material they leave behind is now getting composted, their fecal matter, the remains of their prey, things like that. Now, rove beetles can often be confused for earwigs, but let's look at that rove beetle again. You can see that back here there are no large pincers on the back of the abdomen. All earwigs will have very noticeable pincers there. Rope beetles lack that. There's also some difference in the leg shape and the antennae. I'm not going to bore you with that part. Just remember that if you see these, check for pincers. If they're not obvious, you don't have to worry. They're not an earwig. Another type of beetle is one that is extraordinarily common. So the previous beetle we talked about, rope beetles, they have a large clade. They have somewhere in the neighborhood of like 4,000 members. There's 4,000 species in there. Whereas carabid beetles have an enormously large number of species within their group. They're perhaps the most common group of beetles, and they include things like tiger beetles that belong to that group. And for those of you who are entomology buffs, this is family Carabidae. Now, these are almost entirely predatory beetles. They will just trundle along the ground, and if it's living and they run into it, they're going to try to eat it. I wouldn't really call them potentially harmful to people. I mean, don't stick your finger right in their mouth part. Some of them have rather large mandibles, and I bet it would hurt. But they are also mainly focused on other insects, other small organisms that they're able to get their mouth parts on to be able to eat. Think of these guys like little tanks. They're virtually unkillable. They go everywhere, but they are primarily on the ground, and they're going to stay on the ground. What they're doing too, some of them will also help consume seeds of weedy species. So that means they're providing a benefit there in your compost. They are eliminating weedy species, and they will help manage those populations. And of course, just like the rove beetles, if they're eating anything living, they're going to help add to that compost and that organic matter either through their feces, their frass, or through the remains of whatever prey they were just consuming. Now, the thing that I want to make sure that I bring up is that these are native species and they are contributing to your compost. These are all native, all the ones that I just showed you. They will either contribute directly because they are breaking down material, or they're going to be indirect where they are leaving material that can be broken down. So neither way, if they're a predator or if they're some kind of scavenger, they're still helping. In the setting like this one, there are very few pest species that really exist here because a lot of species that you would consider a pest actually are beneficial. Note that I didn't show snails or slugs there, but still, in this system, snails and slugs are going to be beneficial. And the best strategy when it comes to these species is keep your compost diverse, and let the ecosystem just run. Compost is an ecosystem, it's a complex one. And as long as you're doing the best management practices for it, those species are going to come in and are going to help you out. However, sometimes you can run into problems. Not all the species you work with are going to be native. Some of them can be very problematic, and I want to make sure that we're aware of a few of them. I'm going to start with one that's a little controversial in the way I look at it, so bear with me. So first off, I'm going to look at earthworms. This is a basic night crawler. This is an earthworm that a lot of us have seen all over the place, especially after it rains. Very common. Earthworms are great in compost. They help break things down. They are one of the big things that you want in your compost. Like I mentioned earlier, they are almost entirely non-native. They don't have very many living native species. They do exist, but they're very rare, and most of us wouldn't know them if we saw them. Most of the native species were eliminated during glaciation. The large glaciers kind of scraped off the topsoil, which killed the native species. The glaciers pulled back and there were no more. When colonization began to happen in North America, a lot of European earthworm species were brought over either in potted plants, soils, or in ships' ballast tanks, which were usually made of soil and rock, and then they would dump their ballast when they reached shore. These species are considered beneficial in gardens, landscaping, and in most kind of row cropping agriculture. However, if you work in environments that I do, like out in the woods, earthworms are actually kind of a problem because the things that they do, where they burrow through soil, they consume detritus, plant detritus on the floor of the whatever system you're looking at, and they increase soil aeration. In a forest, that actually contributes to increases in erosion and causes other kinds of problems. So they're kind of a little bit of a double-edged blade. It depends on whatever setting you're looking at. However, for our purposes in compost, they're beneficial and we want them there. And then there are those that we do not want. And unfortunately, some of these can be very, very problematic. Now, I am going to start to say that this is not a comprehensive list. This is a very, very short list. I just wanted to cover a few that I know are very common here in Indiana, that some of you have probably already dealt with. And I imagine a few of you already know what we are looking at right now. This is poison hemlock, and that is the hemlock famous for Socrates, who was executed by being forced to drink hemlock poison. This is the same one. It's not from a hemlock tree. This is a type of herbaceous plant. This plant is originally from areas of Europe and North Africa, and now it has spread all over Indiana. When you see in the early summer a plant growing that makes you think of wild carrot or Queen Anne's lace, that is actually not wild carrot, that is poison hemlock. Queen Anne's lace doesn't start until later summer. This plant is incredibly toxic when consumed. You do not want livestock near it. You definitely don't want children near it. This stuff is dangerous. However, it generally is not toxic. Well, I shouldn't say that. It has less toxicity when handled, when cut, or when inhaled, but it still has toxicity. So if you are going to handle it when you're trying to remove it, you want to make sure that you have protective equipment when you do so, so that way you don't actually do any kind of contact or inhalation toxicity. Now, a little on what it looks like. These have hollow and smooth stems that usually have a purple coloration. I typically see purple coloration down towards the base of the above ground growth, and they have fleshy white roots underneath the ground. The leaves are pinnately compound, and they will resemble very heavily wild carrots. You'll look at it and you will think that's what you're looking at. The flowers are umbrella-like white flower clusters, typically white flower clusters, I should say, that have a grayish fruit borne late in the summer. The seeds don't disperse very easily, so you tend to see the plants clumping together in groups as the seeds disperse just by getting knocked around, maybe by wind or maybe an animal rushes against it. Of course, since it has fruit, that means that birds might be able to pick it up and spread it, and oftentimes you will find seeds do get spread into compost. And this is, I can't imagine how problematic that would be, especially if you're using your compost to grow food. Uh, I kind of already mentioned using personal protective equipment there. I got a little ahead of myself. Eliminating this usually focuses on the rosette growth. So what this is that this is a biennial plant. The first year, it's going to mostly have this herbaceous rosette growing at the ground, and then the second year, it's going to bolt and grow 3 to 10 feet tall. People who work on eliminating this stuff, you probably already know that usually you want to focus on the first year's growth to try to eliminate it then. Um, I put down here that compost may not be usable with significant growth, especially if you're growing food plants. Now, I don't have data that says one way or another. I didn't have time to check on that, but I'm going to just err on the side of caution and say that if you have poison hemlock growing in compost, you probably need to get rid of the compost. I would not want you to be accidentally exposed to something very toxic. So am just going to say that. And if you guys have questions on that or want me to do a little more research, just let me know either in YouTube comments or you can always reach out and contact me. And of course, you could try pulling it yourself. Use the personal protective equipment. I've had to do this before on my property and it's gotten rid of it. And you don't want to cut it up and try to recompost it, okay? Just it's safe that you want to bag it up and get rid of it. All right, garlic mustard. This is another one that can be a significant problem in compost. Garlic mustard spreads very easily. Now, much like our poison hemlock, it is a biennial herbaceous plant. It's going to have a soft at the above ground kind of growth, the rosette or basal development in that first year, and then it's going to bolt in the following year. The seeds are very easily carried by wind. You can find garlic mustard in virtually every environment here in Indiana. Oftentimes, I will go walking through state parks and I will pull garlic mustard whenever I see it because it is very, very common as you go through a lot of these more naturalized areas now. Now, the good thing about garlic mustard is that it is a species that has a really good taproot. So this one is one that you can actually pull out of the ground and expect it not to regrow so long as you did a good pull on it. And this is an easy way to get rid of it. You just pull the taproot and you keep bagging it up, throwing it away, make sure it set it out in the sun so you kill it and any seeds it has. It will take probably a few years of elimination practice to get fully rid of it because the seeds, it will develop quite a bit of seed. Um, and you want to make sure that you pull the plant and bag it long enough because, as I put in the second point here, seed development may continue after it's pulled. So bagging it and making sure it dies is going to be critical. Don't just assume that the plant is dead at that point. Now, herbicidal treatments do exist for garlic mustard. However, there are a lot of herbicides and different herbicides for each growth stage and time of year almost. So I'm just going to leave that there and leave it to a later program if we want to talk about garlic mustard a little bit more. However, there is a lot of information available through Purdue Extension and many other extension services that talk about this. And I'm always happy to go over it with you if you want. Now, the nightmare critter that I often have to talk about in compost is the Asian jumping worm. This is what I was referring to earlier. Unfortunately, this organism is a really huge problem in compost. And one of the reasons I wanted to include this is that this is a year-round problem in our compost. This year, well, sorry, at the end of last year, rather, I should say, during Purdue's Christmas break, I got contacted by somebody who found live Asian jumping worm in compost that they had bought from the store. Not one that they had on their property already. They went out and bought a bag and they found this in it. Now, I don't know what store, I don't know what product. That is something that I would love to research, but I'm not going to say yet because I want to make sure that I don't accidentally step somewhere I shouldn't. But this is not the first time I have gotten a report like this. However, it is the earliest time that I've gotten one. And it just lends more credence to the idea that this is, in fact, an organism that's able to survive year round in our environment through our compost piles that we have. This is a species that, or sorry, group of species rather, that existed in Asia, and it still exists in Asia, I assume, but it is a species complex. It is not just an individual one. It's usually comprised of two species of Amynthus and one of Metaphyri here in Indiana. However, that species complex is often changing regionally. So if you go to one part of the states and find it, it may be a different set of them in that region as compared to ours. Most likely, this organism has been here for around 100 years from what we've been able to tell from greenhouse records, but it really got attention because it wasn't that big of a problem. But now our environment is warming, we share things a lot more often, and it's able to spread very easily. It typically ruins soil quality pretty badly, so this is an example of what it does. It will consume the organic matter out of the topsoil to the point that they just leave behind nothing but their castings, their feces, which is really dry, hard, and locks in nutrients and doesn't let it go very easily. This is a great picture. I love this one. The red line wasn't originally a part of the picture. I put that there. What it shows is an area where Asian jumping worm has been and the area it has not yet reached. So you could see all the plant detritus and things on top of the soil where the organism isn't yet, and you could see where it has been. And it's really, really telling. Now, there are no pesticides labeled for use on Asian jumping worms, and the research on that is pretty limited so far. I'm hoping to increase that. I just need to find some grant money to be able to do so. However, there is some information that might indicate potential activity from saponins used in soils or in fertilizers. However, that's as of yet unverified. I can't say that that's something that works. That's something that I would love to be looking into, and I hope to sometime in the next year. Now, this means that you will have to physically remove the worms when you find them. And you might find them in your compost, you might find them in potted plants. They are able to survive in those. But the good thing is that they congregate en masse. So physically removing them means that you're going to be taking a bunch of them, usually from one location, bagging them up and making sure they die, or putting them in a bucket of soapy water. However, the big thing about these is that they are very accurately named. They jump. They will writhe around like a snake. They will jump anytime they're poked, and they can jump quite a distance too. So you got to make sure they stay in whatever medium you're trying to kill them in. I typically tell people that prevention is the best thing to do when you're trying to manage this group of species because trying to fully eradicate them can be challenging. They are hermaphroditic, they can reproduce asexually, and they produce a lot of eggs. So I work on prevention, and hopefully you won't get them. It's a lot of work to get rid of them. And then our last invasive I'm going to cover here is one that's a really weird one for those of us in Indiana. Some of you may have seen this one before. This is called a hammerhead worm. These are predators of earthworms and similar species. And unfortunately, they will go after earthworms that we want to keep. Now, this is a fairly large group of flatworms. Flatworms are not related to earthworms. This is a different kind of organism. Flatworms are able to, well, many of them, I should say, are able to regenerate from parts and pieces. So if you took one of these hammerhead worms and cut them up, they could regenerate an entirely new individual from a piece that is as small as 1/279th of the whole. That is an extremely potent survival strategy. And it means that by killing one, if you smash it or cut it up, you could create hundreds of new individuals. Usually, you just want to try to drown these. Much like our earthworms, there is no, or much like our Asian jumping worms, rather, there is no pesticide that is labeled for them. Now, we do have several species here in North America. They are primarily of the Bipalium genus. There are a few others here. I've actually had to identify a few here in Indiana. Like I said, they are predatory. They're free living. They will wander. Sometimes they can get very, very large, as in a couple feet in length, and they're often very disturbing when you see them. People also think that they are a human health concern because some of these species will produce a toxin called tetrodotoxin. Um, this is a really, really dangerous toxin. It is very potent. However, these organisms, I think I skipped a slide here, these organisms lack the ability to administer that toxin to a human being. We're not the right size. This is intended for their prey. So we don't need to worry about that. Though I would recommend if you're going to handle them with gloves. Just be on the safe side with that one. If you try, like I said, there are no pesticides. You're better off just trying to use salt, vinegar solutions, or buckets of soapy water. You just need to make sure the worms don't escape. Like I said, they're free living, which means they're very active. And don't try to smash them. Don't try to cut them up. That will just result in more worms being made and a nightmare for you. Now, that's a whole lot of information being thrown at you. So why don't we boil it down to what steps can you take? What can you do to try to protect your compost? First off, don't try to exchange or trade compost unless it is from a very trusted source. I would almost say just don't try to trade or exchange your compost at all. I'm getting way too many messages about people buying compost and still finding it infested with something like Asian jumping worm. So make sure you know where you're getting that compost. The other thing is to verify what you are adding to the pile. Don't just assume everything is safe. I keep seeing, like I said, the list of invasive species that are in compost, that's actually a very short list. There were dozens of plants that I could have mentioned, including things like tree of heaven, plants that can regrow from parts and pieces. And tree of heaven would love an environment like that. So make sure you know what you are adding to your compost. If you do find something that you think is a problem there, make sure you get it identified. Those of you who live in, well, really any state, but most states will have an extension service where someone can help identify whatever you're looking at for you and help work with you to get rid of it. Especially when it comes to insects. You are all listening to me right now, can contact me with that. And again, monitoring your compost year round is going to be really important because several of these species can develop through that time. Primarily, Asian jumping worm is the one I'm talking about here. Check it, make sure that you don't have species that you don't want. And unfortunately, a lot of these organisms, if you are doing your best management practices for developing your compost and keeping it internally